Chapter 9. Dropped from the Sky. Lieutenant Harold Percy Smith Oldwick, Royal Air Service, was on reconnaissance. A report, or it would be better to say a rumor, had come to the British headquarters in German East Africa that the enemy had landed in force on the west coast and was marching across the Dark Continent to reinforce their colonial troops. In fact, the new army was supposed to be no more than 10 or 12 days' march to the west. Of course, the thing was ridiculous, preposterous, but preposterous things often happen in war, and anyway, no good general permits the least rumor of enemy activity to go uninvestigated. Therefore, Lieutenant Harold Percy Smith Oldwick flew low toward the west, searching with keen eyes for signs of a Hun army. Vast forests unrolled beneath him, in which a German army corps might have lain concealed, so dense was the overhanging foliage of the great trees. Mountain, meadowland, and desert passed in lovely panorama, but never a sight of man had the young lieutenant. Always hoping that he might discover some sign of their passage, a discarded lorry, a broken limber, or an old campsite, he continued farther and farther into the west until well into the afternoon. Above a tree-dotted plain through the center of which flowed a winding river, he determined to turn about and start for camp. It would take straight flying at top speed to cover the distance before dark, but as he had ample gasoline and a trustworthy machine, there was no doubt in his mind but that he could accomplish his aim. It was then that his engine stalled. He was too low to do anything but land, and that immediately, while he had the more open country accessible, for directly east of him was a vast forest into which a stalled engine could only have plunged him to certain injury and probable death. And so he came down in the meadowland near the winding river and there started to tinker with his motor. As he worked, he hummed a tune, some music hall air that had been popular in London the year before, so that one might have thought him working in the security of an English flying field surrounded by innumerable comrades, rather than alone in the heart of an unexplored African wilderness. It was typical of the man that he should be wholly indifferent to his surroundings, although his looks entirely belied any assumption that he was of particularly heroic strain. Lieutenant Harold Percy Smith Oldwick was fair-haired, blue-eyed and slender, with a rosy, boyish face that might have been molded more by an environment of luxury, indolence and ease than the more strenuous exigencies of life's sterner requirements. And not only was the young lieutenant outwardly careless of the immediate future and of his surroundings, but actually so. That the district might be infested by countless enemies seemed not to have occurred to him in the remotest degree. He bent assiduously to the work of correcting the adjustment that had caused his motor to stall without so much as an upward glance at the surrounding country. The forest to the east of him, and the more distant jungle that bordered the winding river, might have harbored an army of bloodthirsty savages, but neither could elicit even a passing show of interest on the part of Lieutenant Smith Oldwick. And even had he looked, it is doubtful if he would have seen the score of figures crouching in the concealment of the undergrowth at the forest's edge. There are those who are reputed to be endowed with that which is sometimes, for want of a better appellation, known as the sixth sense, a species of intuition which apprises them of the presence of an unseen danger. The concentrated gaze of a hidden observer provokes a warning sensation of nervous unrest in such as these, but though 20 pairs of savage eyes were gazing fixedly at Lieutenant Harold Percy Smith Oldwick, the fact aroused no responsive sensation of impending danger in his placid breast. He hummed peacefully, and his adjustment completed, tried out his motor for a minute or two, then shut it off and descended to the ground with the intention of stretching his legs and taking a smoke before continuing his return flight to camp. Now, for the first time, he took note of his surroundings, to be immediately impressed by both the wildness and the beauty of the scene. In some respects, the tree-dotted meadowland reminded him of a park-like English forest, and that wild beasts and savage men could ever be a part of so quiet a scene seemed the remotest of contingencies. Some gorgeous blooms upon a flowering shrub at a little distance from his machine caught the attention of his aesthetic eye, and as he puffed upon his cigarette, he walked over to examine the flowers more closely. As he bent above them, he was probably some 100 yards from his plane, and it was at this instant that Numabo, chief of the Wamabo, chose to leap from his ambush and lead his warriors in a sudden rush upon the white man. The young Englishman's first intimation of danger was a chorus of savage yells from the forest behind him. Turning, he saw a score of naked black warriors advancing rapidly toward him. They moved in a compact mass, and as they approached more closely, their rate of speed noticeably diminished. Lieutenant Smith Oldwick realized in a quick glance that the direction of their approach and their proximity had cut off all chances of retreating to his plane, and he also understood that their attitude was entirely warlike and menacing. He saw that they were armed with spears and with bows and arrows, and he felt quite confident that notwithstanding the fact that he was armed with a pistol, they could overcome him with the first rush. What he did not know about their tactics was that at any show of resistance they would fall back, which is the nature of the native Negroes, but that after numerous advances and retreats, during which they would work themselves into a frenzy of rage by much shrieking, leaping, and dancing, they would eventually come to the point of a determined and final assault. Numabo was in the forefront, a fact which, taken in connection with his considerably greater size and more warlike appearance, indicated him as the natural target, and it was at Numabo that the Englishman aimed his first shot. Unfortunately for him, it missed its target, as the killing of the chief might have permanently dispersed the others. The bullet passed Numabo to lodge in the breast of a warrior behind him, and as the fellow lunged forward with a scream, the others turned and retreated. But to the lieutenant's chagrin, they ran in the direction of the plain instead of back toward the forest, so that he was still cut off from reaching his machine. Presently they stopped and faced him again. They were talking loudly and gesticulating, and after a moment one of them leaped into the air, brandishing his spear and uttering savage war cries, which soon had their effect upon his fellows, so that it was not long ere all of them were taking part in the wild show of savagery, which would bolster their waning courage and presently spur them on to another attack. The second charge brought them closer to the Englishman, and though he dropped another with his pistol, it was not before 2 or 3 spears had been launched at him. He now had 5 shots remaining, and there were still 18 warriors to be accounted for, so that unless he could frighten them off, it was evident that his fate was sealed. That they must pay the price of 1 life for every attempt to take his had its effect upon them, and they were longer now in initiating a new rush, and when they did so it was more skillfully ordered than those that had preceded it, for they scattered into 3 bands which, partially surrounding him, came simultaneously toward him from different directions, and though he emptied his pistol with good effect, they reached him at last. They seemed to know that his ammunition was exhausted, for they circled close about him now with the evident intention of taking him alive, since they might easily have riddled him with their sharp spears with perfect safety to themselves. For 2 or 3 minutes they circled about him until, at a word from Numabo, they closed in simultaneously, and though the slender young lieutenant struck out to right and left, he was soon overwhelmed by superior numbers and beaten down by the hafts of spears in brawny hands. He was all but unconscious when they finally dragged him to his feet, and after securing his hands behind his back, pushed him roughly along ahead of them toward the jungle. As the guard prodded him along the narrow trail, Lieutenant Smith Oldwick could not but wonder why they had wished to take him alive. He knew that he was too far inland for his uniform to have any significance to this native tribe to whom no inkling of the World War probably ever had come, and he could only assume that he had fallen into the hands of the warriors of some savage potentate upon whose royal caprice his fate would hinge. They had marched for perhaps half an hour when the Englishman saw ahead of them, in a little clearing upon the bank of the river, the thatched roofs of native huts showing above a crude but strong palisade. And presently he was ushered into a village street where he was immediately surrounded by a throng of women and children and warriors. Here he was soon the center of an excited mob whose intent seemed to be to dispatch him as quickly as possible. The women were more venomous than the men, striking and scratching him whenever they could reach him, until at last Numabo, the chief, was obliged to interfere to save his prisoner for whatever purpose he was destined. As the warriors pushed the crowd back, opening a space through which the white man was led toward a hut, Lieutenant Smith Oldwick saw coming from the opposite end of the village a number of Negroes wearing odds and ends of German uniforms. He was not a little surprised at this, and his first thought was that he had at last come in contact with some portion of the army which was rumored to be crossing from the west coast, and for signs of which he had been searching. A rueful smile touched his lips as he contemplated the unhappy circumstances which surrounded the accession of this knowledge, for though he was far from being without hope, he realized that only by the merest chance could he escape these people and regain his machine. Among the partially uniformed blacks was a huge fellow in the tunic of a sergeant, and as this man's eyes fell upon the British officer, a loud cry of exultation broke from his lips, and immediately his followers took up the cry and pressed forward to bait the prisoner. "Where did you get the Englishman?" asked Usanga, the black sergeant of the chief Numabo. "Are there many more with him?" "He came down from the sky," replied the native chief, "in a strange thing which flies like a bird, and which frightened us very much at first, but we watched for a long time and saw that it did not seem to be alive, and when this white man left it we attacked him, and though he killed some of my warriors, we took him. for we Wamabos are brave men and great warriors." Usanga's eyes went wide. "He flew here through the sky?" he asked. "Yes," said Numabo. "In a great thing which resembled a bird he flew down out of the sky. The thing is still there where it came down close to the 4 trees near the second bend in the river. We left it there because, not knowing what it was, we were afraid to touch it, and it is still there if it has not flown away again." "It cannot fly," said Usanga, "without this man in it. It is a terrible thing which filled the hearts of our soldiers with terror, for it flew over our camps at night and dropped bombs upon us. It is well that you captured this white man, Numabo, for with his great bird he would have flown over your village tonight and killed all your people. These Englishmen are very wicked white men." "He will fly no more," said Numabo. "It is not intended that a man should fly through the air. Only wicked demons do such things as that, and Numabo the chief will see that this white man does not do it again." And with the words he pushed the young officer roughly toward a hut in the center of the village, where he was left under guard of 2 stalwart warriors. For an hour or more the prisoner was left to his own devices, which consisted in vain and unremitting attempts to loosen the strands which fettered his wrists, and then he was interrupted by the appearance of the black sergeant Usanga, who entered his hut and approached him. "What are they going to do with me?" asked the Englishman. "My country is not at war with these people. You speak their language. Tell them that I am not an enemy, that my people are the friends of the black people, and that they must let me go in peace." Usanga laughed. "They do not know an Englishman from a German," he replied. "It is nothing to them what you are, except that you are a white man and an enemy." "Then why did they take me alive?" asked the lieutenant. "Come," said Usanga, and he led the Englishman to the doorway of the hut. "Look," he said, and pointed a black forefinger toward the end of the village street, where a wider space between the huts left a sort of plaza. Here Lieutenant Harold Percy Smith Oldwick saw a number of negresses engaged in laying fagots around a stake, and in preparing fires beneath a number of large cooking vessels. The sinister suggestion was only too obvious. Usanga was eyeing the white man closely, but if he expected to be rewarded by any signs of fear, he was doomed to disappointment, and the young lieutenant merely turned toward him with a shrug. "Really now, do you beggars intend eating me?" "Not my people," replied Usanga. "We do not eat human flesh, but the Wamabos do. It is they who will eat you, but we will kill you for the feast, Englishman." The Englishman remained standing in the doorway of the hut, an interested spectator of the preparations for the coming orgy that was so horribly to terminate his earthly existence. It can hardly be assumed that he felt no fear yet. If he did, he hid it perfectly beneath an imperturbable mask of coolness. Even the brutal Usanga must have been impressed by the bravery of his victim, since, though he had come to abuse and possibly to torture the helpless prisoner, he now did neither, contenting himself merely with berating whites as a race, and Englishmen especially. Because of the terror the British aviators had caused Germany's native troops in East Africa. "No more," he concluded, "will your great bird fly over our people, dropping death among them from the skies. Usanga will see to that." And he walked abruptly away toward a group of his own fighting men, who were congregated near the stake, where they were laughing and joking with the women. A few minutes later the Englishman saw them pass out of the village gate, and once again his thoughts reverted to various futile plans for escape. Several miles north of the village, on a little rise of ground close to the river, where the jungle, halting at the base of a knoll, had left a few acres of grassy land sparsely wooded, a man and a girl were busily engaged in constructing a small boma, in the center of which a thatched hut already had been erected. They worked almost in silence, with only an occasional word of direction or interrogation between them. Except for a loincloth, the man was naked, his smooth skin tanned to a deep brown by the action of sun and wind. He moved with the graceful ease of a jungle cat, and when he lifted heavy weights, the action seemed as effortless as the raising of empty hands. When he was not looking at her, and it was seldom that he did, the girl found her eyes wandering toward him, and at such times there was always a puzzled expression upon her face, as though she found in him an enigma which she could not solve. As a matter of fact, her feelings toward him were not untinged with awe, since in the brief period of their association she had discovered in this handsome, godlike giant the attributes of the Superman and the savage beast closely intermingled. At first she had felt only that unreasoning feminine terror which her unhappy position naturally induced. To be alone in the heart of an unexplored wilderness of Central Africa with a savage wild man was in itself sufficiently appalling, but to feel also that this man was a blood enemy, that he hated her and her kind, and that in addition thereto he owed her a personal grudge for an attack she had made upon him in the past, left no loophole for any hope that he might accord her even the minutest measure of consideration. She had seen him first months since when he had entered the headquarters of the German High Command in East Africa and carried off the luckless Major Schneider, of whose fate no hint had ever reached the German officers. And she had seen him again upon that occasion when he had rescued her from the clutches of the lion and, after explaining to her that he had recognized her in the British camp, had made her prisoner. It was then that she had struck him down with the butt of her pistol and escaped. That he might seek no personal revenge for her act had been evidenced in Wilhelmstal the night that he had killed Hauptmann Fritz Schneider and left without molesting her. No, she could not fathom him. He hated her, and at the same time he had protected her, as had been evidenced again when he had kept the great apes from tearing her to pieces after she had escaped from the Wamabo village to which Usanga, the black sergeant, had brought her captive. But why was he saving her? For what sinister purpose could this savage enemy be protecting her from the other denizens of his cruel jungle? She tried to put from her mind the probable fate which awaited her, yet it persisted in obtruding itself upon her thoughts, though always she was forced to admit that there was nothing in the demeanor of the man to indicate that her fears were well grounded. She judged him perhaps by the standards other men had taught her, and because she looked upon him as a savage creature, she felt that she could not expect more of chivalry from him than was to be found in the breasts of the civilized men of her acquaintance. Fräulein Bertha Kircher was by nature a companionable and cheerful character. She was not given to morbid forebodings, and above all things she craved the society of her kind, and that interchange of thought which is one of the marked distinctions between man and the lower animals. Tarzan, on the other hand, was sufficient unto himself. Long years of semi-solitude among creatures whose powers of oral expression are extremely limited had thrown him almost entirely upon his own resources for entertainment. His active mind was never idle, but because his jungle mates could neither follow nor grasp the vivid train of imaginings that his man-mind wrote, he had long since learned to keep them to himself, and so now he found no need for confiding them in others. This fact, linked with that of his dislike for the girl, was sufficient to seal his lips for other than necessary conversation, and so they worked on together in comparative silence. Bertha Kircher, however, was nothing if not feminine, and she soon found that having someone to talk to who would not talk was extremely irksome. Her fear of the man was gradually departing, and she was full of 1,000 unsatisfied curiosities as to his plans for the future in so far as they related to her, as well as more personal questions regarding himself. Since she could not but wonder as to his antecedents and his strange and solitary life in the jungle, as well as his friendly intercourse with the savage apes among which she had found him. With the waning of her fears she became sufficiently emboldened to question him, and so she asked him what he intended doing after the hut and boma were completed. "I am going to the west coast where I was born," replied Tarzan. "I do not know when. I have all my life before me, and in the jungle there is no reason for haste. We are not forever running as fast as we can from one place to another, as are you of the outer world. When I have been here long enough, I will go on toward the west. But first I must see that you have a safe place in which to sleep, and that you have learned how to provide yourself with necessaries. That will take time." "You are going to leave me here alone," cried the girl. Her tones marked the fear which the prospect induced. "You are going to leave me here alone in this terrible jungle, a prey to wild beasts and savage men, hundreds of miles from a white settlement, and in a country which gives every evidence of never having been touched by the foot of civilized men." "Why not?" asked Tarzan. "I did not bring you here. Would one of your men accord any better treatment to an enemy woman?" "Yes," she exclaimed, "they certainly would. No man of my race would leave a defenseless white woman alone in this horrible place." Tarzan shrugged his broad shoulders. The conversation seemed profitless, and it was further distasteful to him for the reason that it was carried on in German, a tongue which he detested as much as he did the people who spoke it. He wished that the girl spoke English, and then it occurred to him that, as he had seen her in disguise in the British camp carrying on her nefarious work as a German spy, she probably did speak English, and so he asked her. "Of course I speak English," she exclaimed, "but I did not know that you did." Tarzan looked his wonderment, but made no comment. He only wondered why the girl should have any doubts as to the ability of an Englishman to speak English. And then suddenly it occurred to him that she probably looked upon him merely as a beast of the jungle who, by accident, had learned to speak German through frequenting the district which Germany had colonized. It was there only that she had seen him, and so she might not know that he was an Englishman by birth, and that he had had a home in British East Africa. It was as well, he thought, that she knew little of him, as the less she knew the more he might learn from her, as to her activities in behalf of the Germans and of the German spy system of which she was a representative. And so it occurred to him to let her continue to think that he was only what he appeared to be, a savage denizen of his savage jungle, a man of no race and no country, hating all white men impartially, and this, in truth, was what she did think of him. It explained perfectly his attacks upon Major Schneider and the Major's brother, Hauptmann Fritz. Again they worked on in silence upon the boma, which was now nearly completed, the girl helping the man to the best of her small ability. Tarzan could not but note with grudging approval the spirit of helpfulness she manifested in the oft-times painful labor of gathering and arranging the thorn bushes which constituted the temporary protection against roaming carnivores. Her hands and arms gave bloody token of the sharpness of the numerous points that had lacerated her soft flesh, and even though she were an enemy, Tarzan could not but feel compunction that he had permitted her to do this work, and at last he bade her stop. "Why?" she asked. "It is no more painful to me than it must be to you, and as it is solely for my protection that you are building this boma, there is no reason why I should not do my share." "You are a woman," replied Tarzan. "This is not a woman's work. If you wish to do something, take those gourds I brought this morning and fill them with water at the river. You may need it while I am away." "While you are away," she said. "You are going away?" "When the boma is built I am going out after meat," he replied. "Tomorrow I will go again and take you and show you how you may make your own kills after I am gone." Without a word she took the gourds and walked toward the river. As she filled them, her mind was occupied with painful forebodings of the future. She knew that Tarzan had passed a death sentence upon her, and that the moment that he left her, her doom was sealed, for it could be but a question of time, a very short time, before the grim jungle would claim her. For how could a lone woman hope successfully to combat the savage forces of destruction which constituted so large a part of existence in the jungle? So occupied was she with the gloomy prophecies that she had neither ears nor eyes for what went on about her. Mechanically she filled the gourds and, taking them up, turned slowly to retrace her steps to the boma, only to voice immediately a half-stifled scream and shrink back from the menacing figure looming before her and blocking her way to the hut. Go-Lat, the king ape, hunting a little apart from his tribe, had seen the woman go to the river for water, and it was he who confronted her when she turned back with her filled gourds. Go-Lat was not a pretty creature when judged by standards of civilized humanity, though the Shays of his tribe and even Go-Lat himself considered his glossy black coat shot with silver, his huge arms dangling to his knees, his bullet head sunk between his mighty shoulders, marks of great personal beauty. His wicked, bloodshot eyes and broad nose, his ample mouth and great fighting fangs only enhanced the claim of this Adonis of the forest upon the affections of his Shays. Doubtless in the little savage brain there was a well-formed conviction that this strange she belonging to the Tamangani must look with admiration upon so handsome a creature as Go-Lat. For there could be no doubt in the mind of any that his beauty entirely eclipsed such as the hairless white ape might lay claim to. But Bertha Kircher saw only a hideous beast, a fierce and terrible caricature of man. Could Go-Lat have known what passed through her mind, he must have been terribly chagrined, though the chances are that he would have attributed it to a lack of discernment on her part. Tarzan heard the girl's cry and, looking up, saw at a glance the cause of her terror. Leaping lightly over the boma, he ran swiftly toward her as Go-Lat lumbered closer to the girl, the while he voiced his emotions in low gutturals which, while in reality the most amicable of advances, sounded to the girl like the growling of an enraged beast. As Tarzan drew nearer, he called aloud to the ape, and the girl heard from the human lips the same sounds that had fallen from those of the anthropoid. "I will not harm your she," Go-Lat called to Tarzan. "I know it," replied the ape-man, "but she does not. She is like Numa and Sheeta, who do not understand our talk. She thinks you come to harm her." By this time Tarzan was beside the girl. "He will not harm you," he said to her. "You need not be afraid. This ape has learned his lesson. He has learned that Tarzan is lord of the jungle. He will not harm that which is Tarzan's." The girl cast a quick glance at the man's face. It was evident to her that the words he had spoken meant nothing to him, and that the assumed proprietorship over her was, like the boma, only another means for her protection. "But I am afraid of him," she said. "You must not show your fear. You will be often surrounded by these apes. At such times you will be safest. Before I leave you, I will give you the means of protecting yourself against them should one of them chance to turn upon you. If I were you, I would seek their society. Few are the animals of The jungle that dare attack the great apes when there are several of them together. If you let them know that you are afraid of them, they will take advantage of it and your life will be constantly menaced. The shis especially would attack you. I will let them know that you have the means of protecting yourself and of killing them. If necessary, I will show you how, and then they will respect and fear you. I will try, said the girl, but I am afraid that it will be difficult. He is the most frightful creature I ever have seen. Tarzan smiled. Doubtless he thinks the same of you, he said. By this time other apes had entered the clearing, and they were now the center of a considerable group, among which were several bulls, some young shis, and some older ones with their little ballast clinging to their backs or frolicking around at their feet. Though they had seen the girl the night of the dum-dum when Sheeta had forced her to leap from her concealment into the arena where the apes were dancing, they still evinced a great curiosity regarding her. Some of the shias came very close and plucked at her garments, commenting upon them to one another in their strange tongue. The girl, by the exercise of all the willpower she could command, succeeded in passing through the ordeal without evincing any of the terror and revulsion that she felt. Tarzan watched her closely, a half smile upon his face. He was not so far removed from recent contact with civilized people that he could not realize the torture that she was undergoing, but he felt no pity for this woman of a cruel enemy who doubtless deserved the worst suffering that could be meted to her. Yet, notwithstanding his sentiments toward her, he was forced to admire her fine display of courage. Suddenly he turned to the apes. Tarzan goes to hunt for himself and his she, he said. The she will remain there, and he pointed toward the hut. See that no member of the tribe harms her. Do you understand? The apes nodded. We will not harm her, said Golat. No, said Tarzan. You will not. For if you do, Tarzan will kill you, and then turning to the girl, come. He said, I am going to hunt now. You had better remain at the hut. The apes have promised not to harm you. I will leave my spear with you. It will be the best weapon you could have in case you should need to protect yourself. But I doubt if you will be in any danger for the short time that I am away. He walked with her as far as the boma, and when she had entered, he closed the gap with thorn bushes and turned away toward the forest. She watched him moving across the clearing, noting the easy cat-like tread and the grace of every movement that harmonized so well with the symmetry and perfection of his figure. At the forest's edge she saw him swing lightly into a tree and disappear from view, and then, being a woman, she entered the hut, and throwing herself upon the ground, burst into tears. Chapter 10. In the hands of savages. Tarzan sought Bara, the deer, or Horta, the boar, for of all the jungle animals he doubted if any would prove more palatable to the white woman, but though his keen nostrils were ever on the alert, he traveled far without being rewarded with even the faintest scent spore of the game he sought. Keeping close to the river where he hoped to find Bara or Horta approaching or leaving a drinking place, he came at last upon the strong odor of the Wamabo village, and being ever ready to pay his hereditary enemies, the Gomangani, an undesired visit, he swung into a detour and came up in the rear of the village. From a tree which overhung the palisade he looked down into the street, where he saw the preparations going on which his experience told him indicated the approach of one of those frightful feasts the piece de resistance of which is human flesh. One of Tarzan's chief divertissements was the baiting of the blacks. He realized more keen enjoyment through annoying and terrifying them than from any other source of amusement the grim jungle offered. To rob them of their feast in some way that would strike terror to their hearts would give him the keenest of pleasure, and so he searched the village with his eyes for some indication of the whereabouts of the prisoner. His view was circumscribed by the dense foliage of the tree in which he sat, and so that he might obtain a better view, he climbed further aloft and moved cautiously out upon a slender branch. Tarzan of the Apes possessed a woodcraft scarcely short of the marvelous, but even Tarzan's wondrous senses were not infallible. The branch upon which he made his way outward from the bole was no smaller than many that had borne his weight upon countless other occasions. Outwardly it appeared strong and healthy and was in full foliage, nor could Tarzan know that close to the stem a burrowing insect had eaten away half the heart of the solid wood beneath the bark. And so when he reached a point far out upon the limb, it snapped close to the bole of the tree without warning. Below him were no larger branches that he might clutch, and as he lunged downward his foot caught in a looped creeper, so that he turned completely over and alighted on the flat of his back in the center of the village street. At the sound of the breaking limb and the crashing body falling through the branches, the startled blacks scurried to their huts for weapons, and when the braver of them emerged, they saw the still form of an almost naked white man lying where he had fallen, Emboldened by the fact that he did not move, they approached more closely, and when their eyes discovered no signs of others of his kind in the tree, they rushed forward until a dozen warriors stood about him with ready spears. At first they thought that the falling had killed him, but upon closer examination they discovered that the man was only stunned. One of the warriors was for thrusting a spear through his heart, but Numabo the chief would not permit it. "Bind him," he said. "We will feed well tonight." And so they bound his hands and feet with thongs of gut and carried him into the hut, where Lieutenant Harold Percy Smith Oldwick awaited his fate. The Englishman had also been bound hand and foot by this time for fear that at the last moment he might escape and rob them of their feast. A great crowd of natives were gathered about the hut, attempting to get a glimpse of the new prisoner, but Numabo doubled the guard before the entrance for fear that some of his people, in the exuberance of their savage joy, might rob the others of the pleasures of the death dance which would precede the killing of the victims. The young Englishman had heard the sound of Tarzan's body crashing through the tree to the ground and the commotion in the village which immediately followed, and now, as he stood with his back against the wall of the hut, he looked upon the fellow prisoner that the blacks carried in and laid upon the floor with mixed feelings of surprise and compassion. He realized that he never had seen a more perfect specimen of manhood than that of the unconscious figure before him, and he wondered to what sad circumstances the man owed his capture. It was evident that the new prisoner was himself as much a savage as his captors if apparel and weapons were any criterion by which to judge. Yet it was also equally evident that he was a white man, and from his well-shaped head and clean-cut features that he was not one of those unhappy half-wits who so often revert to savagery even in the heart of civilized communities. As he watched the man, he presently noticed that his eyelids were moving. Slowly they opened, and a pair of grey eyes looked blankly about. With returning consciousness, the eyes assumed their natural expression of keen intelligence, and a moment later, with an effort, the prisoner rolled over upon his side and drew himself to a sitting position. He was facing the Englishman, and as his eyes took in the bound ankles and the arms drawn tightly behind the other's back, a slow smile lighted his features. "They will fill their bellies tonight," he said. The Englishman grinned. "From the fuss they made," he said, "the beggars must be awfully hungry. They like to have eaten me alive when they brought me in. How did they get you?" Tarzan shrugged his head ruefully. "It was my own fault," he replied. "I deserved to be eaten. I crawled out upon a branch that would not bear my weight, and when it broke, instead of alighting on my feet, I caught my foot in a trailer and came down on my head. Otherwise they would not have taken me alive." "Is there no escape?" asked the Englishman. "I have escaped them before," replied Tarzan, "and I have seen others escape them. I have seen a man taken away from the stake after a dozen spear thrusts had pierced his body and the fire had been lighted about his feet." Lieutenant Smith Oldwick shuddered. "God," he exclaimed, "I hope I don't have to face that. I believe I could stand anything but the thought of the fire. I should hate like the devil to go into a funk before the devil's at the last moment." "Don't worry," said Tarzan. "It doesn't last long and you won't funk. It is really not half as bad as it sounds. There is only a brief period of pain before you lose consciousness. I have seen it many times before. It is as good a way to go as another. We must die sometime. What difference whether it be tonight, tomorrow night, or a year hence, just so that we have lived and I have lived." "Your philosophy may be all right," Old Top said the young lieutenant, "but I can't say that it is exactly satisfying." Tarzan laughed. "Roll over here," he said, "where I can get at your bonds with my teeth." The Englishman did as he was bid, and presently Tarzan was working at the thongs with his strong white teeth. He felt them giving slowly beneath his efforts. In another moment they would part, and then it would be a comparatively simple thing for the Englishman to remove the remaining bonds from Tarzan and himself. It was then that one of the guards entered the hut. In an instant he saw what the new prisoner was doing, and raising his spear, struck the ape-man a vicious blow across the head with its shaft. Then he called in the other guards, and together they fell upon the luckless men, kicking and beating them unmercifully, after which they bound the Englishman more securely than before, and tied both men fast on opposite sides of the hut. When they had gone, Tarzan looked across at his companion in misery. "While there is life," he said, "there is hope," but he grinned as he voiced the ancient truism. Lieutenant Harold Percy Smith Oldwick returned the other's smile. "I fancy," he said, "that we are getting short on both. It must be close to supper time now." Zutag hunted alone, far from the balance of the tribe of Golat, the great ape. Zutag Big Neck was a young bull, but recently arrived at maturity. He was large, powerful, and ferocious, and at the same time far above the average of his kind in intelligence, as was denoted by a fuller and less receding forehead. Already Go-Lat saw in this young ape possible contender for the laurels of his kingship, and consequently the old bull looked upon Zutag with jealousy and disfavor. It was for this reason, possibly as much as another, that Zutag hunted so often alone, but it was his utter fearlessness that permitted him to wander far afield away from the protection which numbers gave the great apes. One of the results of this habit was a greatly increased resourcefulness which found him constantly growing in intelligence and powers of observation. Today he had been hunting toward the south, and was returning along the river upon a path he often followed because it led by the village of the Gomangani, whose strange and almost ape-like actions and peculiar manners of living had aroused his interest and curiosity. As he had done upon other occasions, he took up his position in a tree from which he could overlook the interior of the village and watch the blacks at their vocations in the street below. Zutag had scarcely more than established himself in his tree when, with the blacks, he was startled by the crashing of Tarzan's body from the branches of another jungle giant to the ground within the palisade. He saw the Negroes gather about the prostrate form and later carry it into the hut, and once he rose to his full height upon the limb where he had been squatting and raised his face to the heavens to scream out a savage protest and a challenge. For he had recognized in the brown-skinned Tarmangani the strange white ape who had come among them a night or two before in the midst of their dum-dum, and who by so easily mastering the greatest among them had won the savage respect and admiration of this fierce young bull. But Zutag's ferocity was tempered by a certain native cunning and caution. Before he had voiced his protest, there formed in his mind the thought that he would like to save this wonderful white ape from the common enemy, the Gomangani, and so he screamed forth no challenge, wisely determining that more could be accomplished by secrecy and stealth than by force of muscle and fang. At first he thought to enter the village alone and carry off the Tarmangani, but when he saw how numerous were the warriors and that several sat directly before the entrance to the lair into which the prisoner had been carried, it occurred to him that this was work for many rather than one, and so, as silently as he had come, he slipped away through the foliage toward the north. The tribe was still loitering about the clearing where stood the hut that Tarzan and Bertha Kircher had built. Some were idly searching for food just within the forest's edge, while others squatted beneath the shade of trees within the clearing. The girl had emerged from the hut, her tears dried, and was gazing anxiously toward the south into the jungle where Tarzan had disappeared. Occasionally she cast suspicious glances in the direction of the huge shaggy anthropoids about her. How easy it would be for one of those great beasts to enter the boma and slay her. How helpless she was, even with the spear that the white man had left her. She realized as she noted for the 1000th time the massive shoulders, the bull necks, and the great muscles gliding so easily beneath the glossy coats. Never, she thought, had she seen such personifications of brute power as were represented by these mighty bulls. Those huge hands would snap her futile spear as she might snap a match in two, while their lightest blow could crush her into insensibility and death. It was while she was occupied with these depressing thoughts that there dropped suddenly into the clearing from the trees upon the south the figure of a mighty young bull. At that time all of the apes looked much alike to Bertha Kircher, nor was it until some time later that she realized that each differed from the others in individual characteristics of face and figure as do individuals of the human races. Yet even then she could not help but note the wondrous strength and agility of this great beast, and as he approached she even found herself admiring the sheen of his heavy, black, silver-shot coat. It was evident that the newcomer was filled with suppressed excitement. His demeanor and bearing proclaimed this even from afar, nor was the girl the only one to note it, for as they saw him coming many of the apes arose and advanced to meet him, bristling and growling as is their way. Go-Lat was among these latter, and he advanced stiffly with the hairs upon his neck and down his spine erect, uttering low growls and baring his fighting fangs, for who might say whether Zutag came in peace or otherwise? The old king had seen other young apes come thus in his day, filled with a sudden resolution to wrest the kingship from their chief. He had seen bulls about to run amok burst thus suddenly from the jungle upon the members of the tribe, and so Go-Lat took no chances. Had Zutag come indolently, feeding as he came, he might have entered the tribe without arousing notice or suspicion, but when one comes thus precipitately, evidently bursting with some emotion out of the ordinary, let all apes beware. There was a certain amount of preliminary circling, growling and sniffing, stiff-legged and stiff-haired, before each side discovered that the other had no intention of initiating an attack, and then Zutag told Go-Lat what he had seen among the lairs of the Gomangani. Go-Lat grunted in disgust and turned away. "Let the white ape take care of himself," he said. "He is a great ape," said Zutag. "He came to live in peace with the tribe of Go-Lat. Let us save him from the Gomangani." Go-Lat grunted again and continued to move away. "Zutag will go alone and get him," cried the young ape, "if Go-Lat is afraid of the Gomangani." The king ape wheeled in anger, growling loudly and beating upon his breast. "Go-Lat is not afraid," he screamed, "but he will not go, for the white ape is not of his tribe. Go yourself and take the Tarmangani's she with you if you wish so much to save the white ape." "Zutag will go," replied the younger bull, "and he will take the Tarmangani's she and all the bulls of Go-Lat, who are not cowards," and so saying he cast his eyes inquiringly about at the other apes. "Who will go with Zutag to fight the Gomangani and bring away our brother?" he demanded. 8 young bulls in the full prime of their vigor pressed forward to Zutag's side, but the old bulls, with the conservatism and caution of many years upon their grey shoulders, shook their heads and waddled away after Go-Lat. "Good," cried Zutag. "We want no old she-is to go with us to fight the Gomangani, for that is work for the fighters of the tribe." The old bulls paid no attention to his boastful words, but the 8 who had volunteered to accompany him were filled with self-pride, so that they stood around vaingloriously beating upon their breasts, baring their fangs and screaming their hideous challenge until the jungle reverberated to the horrid sound. All this time Bertha Kircher was a wide-eyed and terrified spectator to what, as she thought, could end only in a terrific battle between these frightful beasts, and when Zutag and his followers began screaming forth their fearsome challenge, the girl found herself trembling in terror. For of all the sounds of the jungle there is none more awe-inspiring than that of the great bull ape when he issues his challenge or shrieks forth his victory cry. If she had been terrified before, she was almost paralyzed with fear now as she saw Zutag and his apes turn toward the boma and approach her. With the agility of a cat, Zutag leaped completely over the protecting wall and stood before her. Valiantly she held her spear before her, pointing it at his breast. He commenced to jabber and gesticulate, and even with her scant acquaintance with the ways of the anthropoids, she realized that he was not menacing her. For there was little or no bearing of fighting fangs, and his whole expression and attitude was of one attempting to explain a knotty problem or plead a worthy cause. At last he became evidently impatient, for with a sweep of one great paw he struck the spear from her hand, and coming close seized her by the arm, but not roughly. She shrank away in terror, and yet some sense within her seemed to be trying to assure her that she was in no danger from this great beast. Zutag jabbered loudly, ever and again pointing into the jungle toward the south and moving toward the boma, pulling the girl with him. He seemed almost frantic in his efforts to explain something to her. He pointed toward the boma herself and then to the forest, and then at last, as though by a sudden inspiration, he reached down and, seizing the spear, repeatedly touched it with his forefinger and again pointed toward the south. Suddenly it dawned upon the girl that what the ape was trying to explain to her was related in some way to the white man whose property they thought she was. Possibly her grim protector was in trouble, and with this thought firmly established, she no longer held back, but started forward as though to accompany the young bull. At the point in the boma where Tarzan had blocked the entrance, she started to pull away the thorn bushes, and when Zutag saw what she was doing, he fell to and assisted her, so that presently they had an opening through the boma through which she passed with the great ape. Immediately Zutag and his 8 apes started off rapidly toward the jungle, so rapidly that Bertha Kircher would have had to run at top speed to keep up with them. This she realized she could not do, and so she was forced to lag behind, much to the chagrin of Zutag, who constantly kept running back and urging her to greater speed. Once he took her by the arm and tried to draw her along. Her protests were of no avail, since the beast could not know that they were protests, nor did he desist until she caught her foot in some tangled grass and fell to the ground. Then indeed was Zutag furious and growled hideously. His apes were waiting at the edge of the forest for him to lead them. He suddenly realized that this poor weak she could not keep up with them, and that if they traveled at her slow rate they might be too late to render assistance to the Tarmangani, and so without more ado the giant anthropoid picked Bertha Kircher bodily from the ground and swung her to his back. Her arms were about his neck, and in this position he seized her wrists in one great paw so that she could not fall off, and started at a rapid rate to join his companions. Dressed as she was in riding breeches with no entangling skirts to hinder or catch upon passing shrubbery, she soon found that she could cling tightly to the back of the mighty bull, and when a moment later he took to the lower branches of the trees. She closed her eyes and clung to him in terror lest she be precipitated to the ground below. That journey through the primeval forest with the 9 great apes will live in the memory of Bertha Kircher for the balance of her life, as clearly delineated as at the moment of its enactment. The first overwhelming wave of fear having passed, she was at last able to open her eyes and view her surroundings with increased interest, and presently the sensation of terror slowly left her to be replaced by one of comparative security when she saw the ease and surety with which these great beasts travelled through the trees. And later her admiration for the young bull increased as it became evident that even burdened with her additional weight, he moved more rapidly and with no greater signs of fatigue than his unburdened fellows. Not once did Zutag pause until he came to a stop among the branches of a tree no great distance from the native village. They could hear the noises of the life within the palisade, the laughing and shouting of the Negroes and the barking of dogs, and through the foliage the girl caught glimpses of the village from which she had so recently escaped. She shuddered to think of the possibility of having to return to it and of possible recapture, and she wondered why Zutag had brought her here. Now the apes advanced slowly once more and with great caution, moving as noiselessly through the trees as the squirrels themselves until they had reached a point where they could easily overlook the palisade and the village street below. Zutag squatted upon a great branch close to the bole of the tree, and by loosening the girl's arms from about his neck, indicated that she was to find a footing for herself, and when she had done so, he turned toward her and pointed repeatedly at the open doorway of a hut upon the opposite side of the street below them. By various gestures he seemed to be trying to explain something to her, and at last she caught at the germ of his idea that her white man was a prisoner there. Beneath them was the roof of a hut onto which she saw that she could easily drop, but what she could do after she had entered the village was beyond her. Darkness was already falling and the fires beneath the cooking pots had been lighted. The girl saw the stake in the village street and the piles of fagots about it, and in terror she suddenly realized the portent of these grisly preparations. Oh, if she but only had some sort of a weapon that might give her even a faint hope, some slight advantage against the blacks. Then she would not hesitate to venture into the village in an attempt to save the man who had upon 3 different occasions saved her. She knew that he hated her, and yet strong within her breast burned the sense of her obligation to him. She could not fathom him. Never in her life had she seen a man at once so paradoxical and dependable. In many of his ways he was more savage than the beasts with which he associated, and yet, on the other hand, he was as chivalrous as a knight of old. For several days she had been lost with him in the jungle, absolutely at his mercy, yet she had come to trust so implicitly in his honor that any fear she had had of him was rapidly disappearing. On the other hand, that he might be hideously cruel was evidenced to her by the fact that he was planning to leave her alone in the midst of the frightful dangers which menaced her by night and by day. Zutag was evidently waiting for darkness to fall before carrying out whatever plans had matured in his savage little brain, for he and his fellows sat quietly in the tree about her, watching the preparations of the blacks. Presently it became apparent that some altercation had arisen among the Negroes, for a score or more of them were gathered around one who appeared to be their chief, and all were talking and gesticulating heatedly. The argument lasted for some 5 or 10 minutes, when suddenly the little knot broke, and 2 warriors ran to the opposite side of the village, from whence they presently returned with a large stake which they soon set up beside the one already in place. The girl wondered what the purpose of the second stake might be, nor did she have long to wait for an explanation. It was quite dark by this time, the village being lighted by the fitful glare of many fires, and now she saw a number of warriors approach and enter the hut Zutag had been watching. A moment later they reappeared, dragging between them 2 captives, one of whom the girl immediately recognized as her protector and the other as an Englishman in the uniform of an aviator. This, then, was the reason for the 2 stakes. Arising quickly, she placed a hand upon Zutag's shoulder and pointed down into the village. "Come," she said, as if she had been talking to one of her own kind, and with the word she swung lightly to the roof of the hut below. From there to the ground was but a short drop, and a moment later she was circling the hut upon the side farthest from the fires, keeping in the dense shadows where there was little likelihood of being discovered. She turned once to see that Zutag was directly behind her and could see his huge bulk looming up in the dark, while beyond was another one of his 8. Doubtless they had all followed her, and this fact gave her a greater sense of security and hope than she had before experienced. Pausing beside the hut next to the street, she peered cautiously about the corner. A few inches from her was the open doorway of the structure, and beyond, farther down the village street, the blacks were congregating about the prisoners, who were already being bound to the stakes. All eyes were centered upon the victims, and there was only the remotest chance that she and her companions would be discovered until they were close upon the blacks. She wished, however, that she might have some sort of a weapon with which to lead the attack, for she could not know, of course, for a certainty whether the great apes would follow her or not. Hoping that she might find something within the hut, she slipped quickly around the corner and into the doorway, and after her, one by one, came the 9 bulls. Searching quickly about the interior, she presently discovered a spear, and armed with this, she again approached the entrance. Tarzan of the Apes and Lieutenant Harold Percy Smith Oldwick were bound securely to their respective stakes. Neither had spoken for some time. The Englishman turned his head so that he could see his companion in misery. Tarzan stood straight against his stake. His face was entirely expressionless in so far as either fear or anger were concerned. His countenance portrayed bored indifference, though both men knew that they were about to be tortured. "Goodbye, old top," whispered the young lieutenant. Tarzan turned his eyes in the direction of the other and smiled. "Goodbye," he said. "If you want to get it over in a hurry, inhale the smoke and flames as rapidly as you can." "Thanks," replied the aviator, and though he made a wry face, he drew himself up very straight and squared his shoulders. The women and children had seated themselves in a wide circle about the victims, while the warriors, hideously painted, were forming slowly to commence the dance of death. Again, Tarzan turned to his companion. "If you'd like to spoil their fun," he said, "don't make any fuss no matter how much you suffer. If you can carry on to the end without changing the expression upon your face or uttering a single word, you will deprive them of all the pleasures of this part of the entertainment. Goodbye again, and good luck." The young Englishman made no reply, but it was evident from the set of his jaws that the Negroes would get little enjoyment out of him. The warriors were circling now. Presently Numabo would draw first blood with his sharp spear, which would be the signal for the beginning of the torture, after a little of which the fagots would be lighted around the feet of the victims. Closer and closer danced the hideous chief, his yellow, sharp-filed teeth showing in the firelight between his thick, red lips. Now bending double, now stamping furiously upon the ground, now leaping into the air, he danced step by step in the narrowing circle that would presently bring him within spear reach of the intended feast. At last the spear reached out and touched the ape-man on the breast, and when it came away, a little trickle of blood ran down the smooth brown hide, and almost simultaneously there broke from the outer periphery of the expectant audience a woman's shriek, which seemed a signal for a series of hideous screamings, growlings, and barkings, and a great commotion upon that side of the circle. The victims could not see the cause of the disturbance, but Tarzan did not have to see, for he knew by the voices of the apes the identity of the disturbers. He only wondered what had brought them and what the purpose of the attack, for he could not believe that they had come to rescue him. Numabo and his warriors broke quickly from the circle of their dance to see pushing toward them through the ranks of their screaming and terrified people the very white girl who had escaped them a few nights before. And at her back what appeared to their surprised eyes a veritable horde of the huge and hairy forest men, upon whom they looked with considerable fear and awe. Striking to right and left with his heavy fists, tearing with his great fangs, came Zutag the young bull, while at his heels, emulating his example, surged his hideous apes. Quickly they came through the old men and the women and children, for straight toward Numabo and his warriors the girl led them. It was then that they came within range of Tarzan's vision, and he saw with unmixed surprise who it was that led the apes to his rescue. To Zutag he shouted, "Go for the big bulls while the she unbinds me into Bertha Kircher quick. Cut these bonds. The apes will take care of the blacks." Turning from her advance, the girl ran to his side. She had no knife and the bonds were tied tightly, but she worked quickly and coolly, and as Zutag and his apes closed with the warriors, she succeeded in loosening Tarzan's bonds sufficiently to permit him to extricate his own hands, so that in another minute he had freed himself. "Now unbind the Englishman," he cried, and leaping forward, ran to join Zutag and his fellows in their battle against the blacks. Numabo and his warriors, realizing now the relatively small numbers of the apes against them, had made a determined stand, and with spears and other weapons were endeavoring to overcome the invaders. 3 of the apes were already down, killed or mortally wounded, when Tarzan, realizing that the battle must eventually go against the apes unless some means could be found to break the morale of the Negroes, cast about him for some means of bringing about the desired end. And suddenly his eye lighted upon a number of weapons which he knew would accomplish the result. A grim smile touched his lips as he snatched a vessel of boiling water from one of the fires and hurled it full in the faces of the warriors. Screaming with terror and pain, they fell back, though Numabo urged them to rush forward. Scarcely had the first cauldron of boiling water spilled its contents upon them ere Tarzan deluged them with a second, nor was there any third needed to send them shrieking in every direction to the security of their huts. By the time Tarzan had recovered his own weapons, the girl had released the young Englishman, and with the 6 remaining apes, the 3 Europeans moved slowly toward the village gate, the aviator arming himself with a spear discarded by one of the scalded warriors. As they eagerly advanced toward the outer darkness, Numabo was unable to rally the now thoroughly terrified and painfully burned warriors, so that rescued and rescuers passed out of the village into the blackness of the jungle without further interference. Tarzan strode through the jungle in silence. Beside him walked Zutag, the great ape, and behind them strung the surviving anthropoids, followed by Fraulein Bertha Kircher and Lieutenant Harold Percy Smith Oldwick, the latter a thoroughly astonished and mystified Englishman. In all his life, Tarzan of the Apes had been obliged to acknowledge but few obligations. He won his way through his savage world by the might of his own muscle, the superior keenness of his 5 senses, and his God-given power to reason. Tonight the greatest of all obligations had been placed upon him. His life had been saved by another, and Tarzan shook his head and growled, for it had been saved by one whom he hated above all others. Chapter 11. Finding the Airplane. Tarzan of the Apes, returning from a successful hunt with the body of Bara the deer across one sleek, brown shoulder, paused in the branches of a great tree at the edge of a clearing and gazed ruefully at 2 figures walking from the river to the boma-encircled hut a short distance away. The ape-man shook his tousled head and sighed. His eyes wandered toward the west, and his thoughts to the faraway cabin by the landlocked harbor of the great water that washed the beach of his boyhood home to the cabin of his long-dead father, to which the memories and treasures of a happy childhood lured him. Since the loss of his mate, a great longing had possessed him to return to the haunts of his youth, to the untracked jungle wilderness, where he had lived the life he loved best long before man had invaded the precincts of his wild stamping grounds. There he hoped in a renewal of the old life, under the old conditions, to win surcease from sorrow and perhaps some measure of forgetfulness. But the little cabin and the landlocked harbor were many long, weary marches away, and he was handicapped by the duty which he felt he owed to the 2 figures walking in the clearing before him. One was a young man in a worn and ragged uniform of the British Royal Air Forces, the other a young woman in the even more disreputable remnants of what once had been trim riding togs. A freak of fate had thrown these 3 radically different types together. One was a savage, almost naked beast man, one an English army officer, and the woman, she whom the ape-man knew and hated as a German spy. How he was to get rid of them Tarzan could not imagine unless he accompanied them upon the weary march back to the east coast, a march that would necessitate his once more retracing the long, weary way he already had covered towards his goal. Yet what else could be done? These 2 had neither the strength, endurance, nor jungle craft to accompany him through the unknown country to the west, nor did he wish them with him. The man he might have tolerated, but he could not even consider the presence of the girl in the far-off cabin, which had in a way become sacred to him through its memories, without a growl or anger rising to his lips. There remained, then, but the one way, since he could not desert them. He must move by slow and irksome marches back to the east coast, or at least to the first white settlement in that direction. He had, it is true, contemplated leaving the girl to her fate, but that was before she had been instrumental in saving him from torture and death at the hands of the Black Wamabos. He chafed under the obligation she had put upon him, but no less did he acknowledge it, and as he watched the 2, the rueful expression upon his face was lightened by a smile as he thought of the helplessness of them. What a puny thing indeed was man! How ill-equipped to combat the savage forces of nature and of nature's jungle! Why, even the tiny Balu of the tribe of Golat, the great ape, was better fitted to survive than these, for a Balu could at least escape the numerous creatures that menaced its existence, while with the possible exception of Kota, the tortoise, none moved so slowly as did helpless and feeble man. Without him these 2 doubtless would starve in the midst of plenty, should they by some miracle escape the other forces of destruction which constantly threatened them. That morning Tarzan had brought them fruit, nuts, and plantain, and now he was bringing them the flesh of his kill, while the best that they might do was to fetch water from the river. Even now, as they walked across the clearing toward the boma, they were in utter ignorance of the presence of Tarzan near them. They did not know that his sharp eyes were watching them, nor that other eyes less friendly were glaring at them from a clump of bushes close beside the boma entrance. They did not know these things, but Tarzan did. No more than they could he see the creature crouching in the concealment of the foliage, yet he knew that it was there and what it was and what it was and what its intentions, precisely as well as though it had been lying in the open. A slight movement of the leaves at the top of a single stem had apprised him of the presence of a creature there, for the movement was not that imparted by the wind. It came from pressure at the bottom of the stem, which communicates a different movement to the leaves than does the wind passing among them, as anyone who has lived his lifetime in the jungle well knows. And the same wind that passed through the foliage of the bush brought to the ape-man's sensitive nostrils indisputable evidence of the fact that Sheeta, the panther, waited there for the two returning from the river. They had covered half the distance to the boma entrance when Tarzan called to them to stop. They looked in surprise in the direction from which his voice had come to see him drop lightly to the ground and advance toward them. "Come slowly toward me," he called to them. "Do not run, for if you run, Sheeta will charge." They did as he bid, their faces filled with questioning wonderment. "What do you mean?" asked the young Englishman. "Who is Sheeta?" But for answer the ape-man suddenly hurled the carcass of Bara, the deer, to the ground and leaped quickly toward them, his eyes upon something in their rear, and then it was that the two turned and learned the identity of Sheeta, for behind them was a devil-faced cat charging rapidly toward them. Sheeta, with rising anger and suspicion, had seen the ape-man leap from the tree and approach the quarry. His life's experiences, backed by instinct, told him that the Tarmangani was about to rob him of his prey, and as Sheeta was hungry, he had no intention of being thus easily deprived of the flesh he already considered his own. The girl stifled an involuntary scream as she saw the proximity of the fanged fury bearing down upon them. She shrank close to the man and clung to him, and all unarmed and defenseless as he was, the Englishman pushed her behind him and, shielding her with his body, stood squarely in the face of the panther's charge. Tarzan noted the act, and though accustomed as he was to acts of courage, he experienced a thrill from the hopeless and futile bravery of the man. The charging panther moved rapidly, and the distance which separated the bush in which he had concealed himself from the objects of his desire was not great. In the time that one might understandingly read a dozen words, the strong-limbed cat could have covered the entire distance and made his kill, yet if Sheeta was quick, quick too was Tarzan. The English lieutenant saw the ape-man flash by him like the wind. He saw the great cat veer in his charge as though to elude the naked savage rushing to meet him, as it was evidently Sheeta's intention to make good his kill before attempting to protect it from Tarzan. Lieutenant Smith Oldwick saw these things, and then with increasing wonder he saw the ape-man swerve too and leap for the spotted cat as a football player leaps for a runner. He saw the strong, brown arms encircling the body of the carnivore, the left arm in front of the beast's left shoulder and the right arm behind his right foreleg, and with the impact the two together rolling over and over upon the turf. He heard the snarls and growls of bestial combat, and it was with a feeling of no little horror that he realized that the sounds coming from the human throat of the battling man could scarce be distinguished from those of the panther. The first momentary shock of terror over, the girl released her grasp upon the Englishman's arm. "Cannot we do something?" she asked. "Cannot we help him before the beast kills him?" The Englishman looked upon the ground for some missile with which to attack the panther, and then the girl uttered an exclamation and started at a run toward the hut. "Wait there," she called over her shoulder. "I will fetch the spear that he left me." Smith Oldwick saw the raking talons of the panther searching for the flesh of the man, and the man on his part straining every muscle and using every artifice to keep his body out of range of them. The muscles of his arms knotted under the brown hide. The veins stood out upon his neck and forehead, as with ever-increasing power he strove to crush the life from the great cat. The ape-man's teeth were fastened in the back of Sheeta's neck, and now he succeeded in encircling the beast's torso with his legs, which he crossed and locked beneath the cat's belly. Leaping and snarling, Sheeta sought to dislodge the ape-man's hold upon him. He hurled himself upon the ground and rolled over and over. He reared upon his hind legs and threw himself backwards, but always the savage creature upon his back clung tenaciously to him, and always the mighty brown arms crushed tighter and tighter about his chest. And then the girl, panting from her quick run, returned with the short spear Tarzan had left her as her sole weapon of protection. She did not wait to hand it to the Englishman, who ran forward to receive it, but brushed past him and leaped into close quarters beside the growling, tumbling mass of yellow fur and smooth brown hide. Several times she attempted to press the point home into the cat's body, but on both occasions the fear of endangering the ape-man caused her to desist. But at last the two lay motionless for a moment, as the carnivore sought a moment's rest from the strenuous exertions of battle. And then it was that Bertha Kircher pressed the point of the spear to the tawny side and drove it deep into the savage heart. Tarzan rose from the dead body of Sheeta and shook himself after the manner of beasts that are entirely clothed with hair. Like many other of his traits and mannerisms, this was the result of environment rather than heredity or reversion, and even though he was outwardly a man, the Englishman and the girl were both impressed with the naturalness of the act. It was as though Numa, emerging from a fight, had shaken himself to straighten his rumpled mane and coat, and yet, too, there was something uncanny about it, as there had been when the savage growls and hideous snarls issued from those clean-cut lips. Tarzan looked at the girl, a quizzical expression upon his face. Again had she placed him under obligations to her, and Tarzan of the Apes did not wish to be obligated to a German spy, yet in his honest heart he could not but admit a certain admiration for her courage, a trait which always greatly impressed the ape-man, he himself the personification of courage. "Here is the kill," he said, picking the carcass of Bara from the ground. "You will want to cook your portion, I presume, but Tarzan does not spoil his meat with fire." They followed him to the boma, where he cut several pieces of meat from the carcass for them, retaining a joint for himself. The young lieutenant prepared a fire, and the girl presided over the primitive culinary rites of their simple meal. As she worked some little way apart from them, the lieutenant and the ape-man watched her. "She is wonderful, is she not?" murmured Smith Oldwick. "She is a German and a spy," replied Tarzan. The Englishman turned quickly upon him. "What do you mean?" he cried. "I mean what I say," replied the ape-man. "She is a German and a spy." "I do not believe it," exclaimed the aviator. "You do not have to," Tarzan assured him. "It is nothing to me what you believe. I saw her in conference with the Boucher general and his staff at the camp near Taveta. They all knew her and called her by name, and she handed him a paper. The next time I saw her, she was inside the British lines in disguise. And again I saw her bearing word to a German officer at Wilhelmstal. She is a German and a spy, but she is a woman, and therefore I cannot destroy her." "You really believe that what you say is true?" asked the young lieutenant. "My God, I cannot believe it. She is so sweet and brave and good." The ape-man shrugged his shoulders. "She is brave," he said, "but even Pamba, the rat, must have some good quality, but she is what I have told you, and therefore I hate her, and you should hate her." Lieutenant Harold Percy Smith Oldwick buried his face in his hands. "God forgive me," he said at last. "I cannot hate her." The ape-man cast a contemptuous look at his companion and arose. "Tarzan goes again to hunt," he said. "You have enough food for 2 days. By that time he will return." The two watched him until he had disappeared in the foliage of the trees at the further side of the clearing. When he had gone, the girl felt a vague sense of apprehension that she never experienced when Tarzan was present. The invisible menaces lurking in the grim jungle seemed more real and much more imminent now that the ape-man was no longer near. While he had been there talking with them, the little thatched hut and its surrounding thorn boma had seemed as safe a place as the world might afford. She wished that he had remained. 2 days seemed an eternity in contemplation, 2 days of constant fear, 2 days every moment of which would be fraught with danger. She turned toward her companion. "I wish that he had remained," she said. "I always feel so much safer when he is near. He is very grim and very terrible, and yet I feel safer with him than with any man I ever have known. He seems to dislike me, and yet I know that he would let no harm befall me. I cannot understand him." "Neither do I understand him," replied the Englishman, "but I know this much: our presence here is interfering with his plans. He would like to be rid of us, and I half imagine that he rather hopes to find when he returns that we have succumbed to one of the dangers which must always confront us in this savage land. I think that we should try to return to the white settlements. This man does not want us here, nor is it reasonable to assume that we could long survive in such a savage wilderness. I have traveled and hunted in several parts of Africa, but never have I seen or heard of any single locality so overrun with savage beasts and dangerous natives. If we set out for the east coast at once, we would be in but little more danger than we are here, and if we could survive a day's march, I believe that we will find the means of reaching the coast in a few hours. For my plane must still be in the same place that I landed just before the blacks captured me. Of course, there is no one here who could operate it, nor is there any reason why they should have destroyed it. As a matter of fact, the natives would be so fearful and suspicious of so strange and incomprehensible a thing that the chances are they would not dare approach it. Yes, it must be where I left it, and all ready to carry us safely to the settlements." "But we cannot leave," said the girl. Until he returns, we could not go away like that without thanking him or bidding him farewell. We are under too great obligations to him." The man looked at her in silence for a moment. He wondered if she knew how Tarzan felt toward her, and then he himself began to speculate upon the truth of the ape man's charges. The longer he looked at the girl, the less easy was it to entertain the thought that she was an enemy spy. He was upon the point of asking her point blank, but he could not bring himself to do so, finally determining to wait until time and longer acquaintance should reveal the truth or falsity of the accusation. "I believe," he said, as though there had been no pause in their conversation, "that the man would be more than glad to find us gone when he returns. It is not necessary to jeopardize our lives for 2 more days in order that we may thank him. However much we may appreciate his services to us, you have more than balanced your obligations to him, and from what he told me I feel that you especially should not remain here longer." The girl looked up at him in astonishment. "What do you mean?" she asked. "I do not like to tell," said the Englishman, digging nervously at the turf with the point of a stick, "but you have my word that he would rather you were not here." "Tell me what he said," she insisted. "I have a right to know." Lieutenant Smith Oldwick squared his shoulders and raised his eyes to those of the girl. "He said that he hated you," he blurted. "He has only aided you at all from a sense of duty because you are a woman." The girl paled and then flushed. "I will be ready to go," she said, "in just a moment. We had better take some of this meat with us. There is no telling when we will be able to get more." And so the two set out down the river toward the south. The man carried the short spear that Tarzan had left with the girl, while she was entirely unarmed except for a stick she had picked up from among those left after the building of the hut. Before departing, she had insisted that the man leave a note for Tarzan thanking him for his care of them and bidding him goodbye. This they left pinned to the inside wall of the hut with a little sliver of wood. It was necessary that they be constantly on the alert, since they never knew what might confront them at the next turn of the winding jungle trail, or what might lie concealed in the tangled bushes at either side. There was also the ever-present danger of meeting some of Numabo's black warriors, and as the village lay directly in their line of march, there was the necessity for making a wide detour before they reached it, in order to pass around it without being discovered. "I am not so much afraid of the native blacks," said the girl, "as I am of Usanga and his people. He and his men were all attached to a German native regiment. They brought me along with them when they deserted, either with the intention of holding me ransom or selling me into the harem of one of the black sultans of the north. Usanga is much more to be feared than Numamabo, for he has had the advantage of European military training and is armed with more or less modern weapons and ammunition." "It is lucky for me," remarked the Englishman, "that it was the ignorant Numabo who discovered and captured me, rather than the worldly wise Usanga. He would have felt less fear of the giant flying machine, and would have known only too well how to wreck it." "Let us pray that the black sergeant has not discovered it," said the girl. They made their way to a point which they guessed was about a mile above the village. Then they turned into the trackless tangle of undergrowth to the east. So dense was the verdure at many points that it was with the utmost difficulty they wormed their way through, sometimes on hands and knees, and again by clambering over numerous fallen tree trunks. Interwoven with dead limbs and living branches were the tough and rope-like creepers which formed a tangled network across their path. South of them, in an open meadowland, a number of black warriors were gathered about an object which elicited much wondering comment. The blacks were clothed in fragments of what had once been uniforms of a native German command. They were a most unlovely band, and chief among them in authority and repulsiveness was the black sergeant Usanga. The object of their interest was a British aeroplane. Immediately after the Englishman had been brought to Numabo's village, Usanga had gone out in search of the plane, prompted partially by curiosity and partially by an intention to destroy it, but when he had found it, some new thought had deterred him from carrying out his design. The thing represented considerable value, as he well knew, and it had occurred to him that in some way he might turn his prize to profit. Every day he had returned to it, and while at first it had filled him with considerable awe, he eventually came to look upon it with the accustomed eye of a proprietor, so that he now clambered into the fuselage and even advanced so far as to wish that he might learn to operate it. What a feat it would be indeed to fly like a bird far above the highest tree top! How it would fill his less favored companions with awe and admiration! If Usanga could but fly, so great would be the respect of all the tribesmen throughout the scattered villages of the great interior. They would look upon him as little less than a god. Usanga rubbed his palms together and smacked his thick lips. Then indeed would he be very rich, for all the villages would pay tribute to him, and he could even have as many as 12 wives. With that thought, however, came a mental picture of Naratu, the black termagant, who ruled him with an iron hand. Usanga made a wry face and tried to forget the extra 12 wives, but the lure of the idea remained and appealed so strongly to him that he presently found himself reasoning most logically that a god would not be much of a god with less than 24 wives. He fingered the instruments and the control, half hoping and half fearing that he would alight upon the combination that would put the machine in flight. Often had he watched the British airmen soaring above the German lines, and it looked so simple he was quite sure that he could do it himself if there was somebody who could but once show him how. There was, of course, always the hope that the white man who came in the machine and who had escaped from Numabo's village might fall into Usanga's hands, and then indeed would he be able to learn how to fly. It was in this hope that Usanga spent so much time in the vicinity of the plane, reasoning as he did that eventually the white man would return in search of it. And at last he was rewarded, for upon this very day after he had quit the machine and entered the jungle with his warriors, he heard voices to the north, and when he and his men had hidden in the dense foliage upon either side of the trail, Usanga was presently filled with elation by the appearance of the British officer and the white girl whom the black sergeant had coveted and who had escaped him. The Negro could scarce restrain a shout of elation, for he had not hoped that fate would be so kind as to throw these two whom he most desired into his power at the same time. As the two came down the trail, all unconscious of impending danger, the man was explaining that they must be very close to the point at which the plane had landed. Their entire attention was centered on the trail directly ahead of them, as they momentarily expected it to break into the meadowland where they were sure they would see the plane that would spell life and liberty for them. The trail was broad, and they were walking side by side so that, at a sharp turn, the park-like clearing was revealed to them simultaneously with the outlines of the machine they sought. Exclamations of relief and delight broke from their lips, and at the same instant Usanga and his black warriors rose from the bushes all about them. Chapter 12. The Black Flyer. The girl was almost crushed by terror and disappointment. To have been thus close to safety and then to have all hope snatched away by a cruel stroke of fate seemed unendurable. The man was disappointed too, but more was he angry. He noted the remnants of the uniforms upon the blacks, and immediately he demanded to know where were their officers. "They cannot understand you," said the girl, and so in the bastard tongue that is the medium of communication between the Germans and the blacks of their colony, she repeated the white man's question. Usanga grinned. "You know where they are, white woman," he replied. "They are dead, and if this white man does not do as I tell him, he too will be dead." "What do you want of him?" asked the girl. "I want him to teach me how to fly like a bird," replied Usanga. Bertha Kircher looked her astonishment, but repeated the demand to the lieutenant. The Englishman meditated for a moment. "He wants to learn to fly, does he?" he repeated. "Ask him if he will give us our freedom if I teach him to fly." The girl put the question to Usanga, who, degraded, cunning, and entirely unprincipled, was always perfectly willing to promise anything whether he had any intentions of fulfilling his promises or not, and so immediately assented to the proposition. "Let the white man teach me to fly," he said, "and I will take you back close to the settlements of your people, but in return for this, I shall keep the great bird," and he waved a black hand in the direction of the aeroplane. When Bertha Kircher had repeated Usanga's proposition to the aviator, the latter shrugged his shoulders and with a wry face finally agreed. "I fancy there is no other way out of it," he said. "In any event, the plane is lost to the British government, if I refuse the black scoundrel's request. There is no doubt but what he will make short work of me, with the result that the machine will lie here until it rots. If I accept his offer, it will at least be the means of assuring your safe return to civilization, and that," he added, "is worth more to me than all the planes in the British air service." The girl cast a quick glance at him. These were the first words he had addressed to her that might indicate that his sentiments toward her were more than those of a companion in distress. She regretted that he had spoken as he had, and he, too, regretted it almost instantly as he saw the shadow cross her face and realized that he had unwittingly added to the difficulties of her already almost unbearable situation. "Forgive me," he said quickly. "Please forget what that remark implied. I promise you that I will not offend again, if it does offend you, until after we are both safely out of this mess." She smiled and thanked him, but the thing had been said and could never be unsaid, and Bertha Kircher knew even more surely than as though he had fallen upon his knees and protested undying devotion that the young English officer loved her. Usanga was for taking his first lesson in aviation immediately. The Englishman attempted to dissuade him, but immediately the black became threatening and abusive, since, like all those who are ignorant, he was suspicious that the intentions of others were always ulterior unless they perfectly coincided with his wishes. "All right, old top," muttered the Englishman, "I will give you the lesson of your life," and then turning to the girl, persuade him to let you accompany us. "I shall be afraid to leave you here with these devilish scoundrels." But when she put the suggestion to Usanga, the black immediately suspected some plan to thwart him, possibly to carry him against his will back to the German masters he had traitorously deserted, and glowering at her savagely, he obstinately refused to entertain the suggestion. "The white woman will remain here with my people," he said. "They will not harm her, unless you fail to bring me back safely." "Tell him," said the Englishman, "that if you are not standing in plain sight in this meadow when I return, I will not land, but will carry Usanga back to the British camp and have him hanged." Usanga promised that the girl would be in evidence upon their return, and took immediate steps to impress upon his warriors that under penalty of death they must not harm her. Then, followed by the other members of his party, he crossed the clearing toward the plain with the Englishman. Once seated within what he already considered his new possession, the black's courage began to wane, and when the motor was started and the great propeller commenced to whir, he screamed to the Englishman to stop the thing and permit him to alight. But the aviator could neither hear nor understand the black above the noise of the propeller and exhaust. By this time the plane was moving along the ground, and even then Usanga was upon the verge of leaping out, and would have done so had he been able to unfasten the strap from about his waist. Then the plane rose from the ground and in a moment soared gracefully in a wide circle until it topped the trees. The black sergeant was in a veritable collapse of terror. He saw the earth dropping rapidly from beneath him. He saw the trees and river, and at a distance the little clearing with the thatched huts of Numabo's village. He tried hard not to think of the results of a sudden fall to the rapidly receding ground below. He attempted to concentrate his mind upon the 24 wives which this great bird most assuredly would permit him to command. Higher and higher rose the plane, swinging in a wide circle above the forest, river, and meadowland, and presently, much to his surprise, Usanga discovered that his terror was rapidly waning, so that it was not long before there was forced upon him a consciousness of utter security. And then it was that he began to take notice of the manner in which the white man guided and manipulated the plane. After half an hour of skillful maneuvering, the Englishman rose rapidly to a considerable altitude, and then suddenly, without warning, he looped and flew with the plane inverted for a few seconds. "I said I'd give this beggar the lesson of his life," he murmured as he heard, even above the whir of the propeller, the shriek of the terrified Negro. A moment later Smith Oldwick had righted the machine and was dropping rapidly toward the earth. He circled slowly a few times above the meadow until he had assured himself that Bertha Kircher was there and apparently unharmed. Then he dropped gently to the ground so that the machine came to a stop a short distance from where the girl and the warriors awaited them. It was a trembling and ashen-hued Usanga who tumbled out of the fuselage, for his nerves were still on edge as a result of the harrowing experience of the loop. Yet with terra firma once more underfoot, he quickly regained his composure. Strutting about with great show and braggadocio, he strove to impress his followers with the mere nothingness of so trivial a feat as flying bird-like thousands of yards above the jungle. Though it was long until he had thoroughly convinced himself by the force of autosuggestion that he had enjoyed every instant of the flight, and was already far advanced in the art of aviation. So jealous was the black of his new-found toy that he would not return to the village of Numabo, but insisted on making camp close beside the plane, lest in some inconceivable fashion it should be stolen from him. For 2 days they camped there, and constantly during daylight hours Usanga compelled the Englishman to instruct him in the art of flying. Smith Oldwick, in recalling the long months of arduous training he had undergone himself before he had been considered sufficiently adept to be considered a finished flyer, smiled at the conceit of the ignorant African who was already demanding that he be permitted to make a flight alone. "If it was not for losing the machine," the Englishman explained to the girl, "I'd let the bounder take it up and break his fool neck as he would do inside of 2 minutes. However, he finally persuaded Usanga to bide his time for a few more days of instruction, but in the suspicious mind of the Negro there was a growing conviction that the white man's advice was prompted by some ulterior motive. That it was in the hope of escaping with the machine himself by night that he refused to admit that Usanga was entirely capable of handling it alone and therefore in no further need of help or instruction, and so in the mind of the black there formed a determination to outwit the white man. The lure of the 24 seductive wives proved in itself a sufficient incentive, and there, too, was added his desire for the white girl whom he had long since determined to possess. It was with these thoughts in mind that Usanga lay down to sleep in the evening of the second day. Constantly, however, the thought of Naratu and her temper arose to take the keen edge from his pleasant imaginings. If he could but rid himself of her. The thought, having taken form, persisted, but always it was more than outweighed by the fact that the black sergeant was actually afraid of his woman, so much afraid of her, in fact, that he would not have dared to attempt to put her out of the way, unless he could do so secretly while she slept. However, as one plan after another was conjured by the strength of his desires, he at last hit upon one which came to him almost with the force of a blow and brought him sitting upright among his sleeping companions. When morning dawned, Usanga could scarce wait for an opportunity to put his scheme into execution, and the moment that he had eaten, he called several of his warriors aside and talked with them for some moments. The Englishman, who usually kept an eye upon his black captor, saw now that the latter was explaining something in detail to his warriors. And from his gestures and his manner it was apparent that he was persuading them to some new plan as well as giving them instructions as to what they were to do. Several times, too, he saw the eyes of the Negroes turned upon him, and once they flashed simultaneously toward the white girl. Everything about the occurrence, which in itself seemed trivial enough, aroused in the mind of the Englishman a well-defined apprehension that something was afoot that boded ill for him and for the girl. He could not free himself of the idea, and so he kept a still closer watch over the black, although, as he was forced to admit to himself, he was quite powerless to avert any fate that lay in store for them. Even the spear that he had had when captured had been taken away from him, so that now he was unarmed and absolutely at the mercy of the black sergeant and his followers. Lieutenant Harold Percy Smith Oldwick did not have long to wait before discovering something of Usanga's plan, for almost immediately after the sergeant finished giving his instructions, a number of warriors approached the Englishman, while 3 went directly to the girl. Without a word of explanation, the warriors seized the young officer and threw him to the ground upon his face. For a moment he struggled to free himself and succeeded in landing a few heavy blows among his assailants, but he was too greatly outnumbered to hope to more than delay them in the accomplishment of their object, which he soon discovered was to bind him securely hand and foot. When they had finally secured him to their satisfaction, they rolled him over on his side, and then it was he saw Bertha Kircher had been similarly trussed. Smith Oldwick lay in such a position that he could see nearly the entire expanse of meadow and the aeroplane a short distance away. Usanga was talking to the girl, who was shaking her head in vehement negatives. "What is he saying?" called the Englishman. "He is going to take me away in the plane," the girl called back. "He is going to take me farther inland to another country where he says that he will be king and the first am to be one of his wives." And then, to the Englishman's surprise, she turned a smiling face toward him. "But there is no danger," she continued, "for we shall both be dead within a few minutes. Just give him time enough to get the machine under way, and if he can rise 100 feet from the ground, I shall never need fear him more." "God," cried the man. "Is there no way that you can dissuade him? Promise him anything. Anything that you want. I have money, more money than that poor fool could imagine there was in the whole world. With it he can buy anything that money will purchase, fine clothes and food and women. All the women he wants. Tell him this, and tell him that if he will spare you, I give him my word that I will fetch it all to him." The girl shook her head. "It is useless," she said. "He would not understand, and if he did understand, he would not trust you. The blacks are so unprincipled themselves that they can imagine no such thing as principle or honor in others. And especially do these blacks distrust an Englishman whom the Germans have taught them to believe are the most treacherous and degraded of people. No, it is better thus. I am sorry that you cannot go with us. For if he goes high enough, my death will be much easier than that which probably awaits you." Usanga had been continually interrupting their brief conversation in an attempt to compel the girl to translate it to him, for he feared that they were concocting some plan to thwart him and to quiet and appease him. She told him that the Englishman was merely bidding her farewell and wishing her good luck. Suddenly she turned to the black. "Will you do something for me?" she asked. "If I go willingly with you." "What is it you want?" he inquired. "Tell your men to free the white man after we are gone. He can never catch us. That is all I ask of you. If you will grant him his freedom and his life, I will go willingly with you." "You will go with me anyway," growled Usanga. "It is nothing to me whether you go willingly or not. I am going to be a great king, and you will do whatever I tell you to do." He had in mind that he would start properly with this woman. There should be no repetition of his harrowing experience with Naratu. This wife and the 24 others should be carefully selected and well-trained. Hereafter Usanga would be master in his own house. Bertha Kircher saw that it was useless to appeal to the brute, and so she held her peace, though she was filled with sorrow in contemplating the fate that awaited the young officer, scarce more than a boy, who had impulsively revealed his love for her. At Usanga's order, one of the blacks lifted her from the ground and carried her to the machine, and after Usanga had clambered aboard, they lifted her up, and he reached down and drew her into the fuselage, where he removed the thongs from her wrists and strapped her into her seat, and then took his own directly ahead of her. The girl turned her eyes toward the Englishman. She was very pale, but her lips smiled bravely. "Goodbye," she cried. "Goodbye, and God bless you," he called back, his voice the least bit husky. "And then the thing I wanted to say, may I say it now? We are so very near the end." Her lips moved, but whether they voiced consent or refusal he did not know, for the words were drowned in the whir of the propeller. The black had learned his lesson sufficiently well, so that the motor was started without bungling, and the machine was soon underway across the meadowland. A groan escaped the lips of the distracted Englishman as he watched the woman he loved being carried to almost certain death. He saw the plane tilt and the machine rise from the ground. It was a good takeoff, as good as Lieutenant Harold Percy Smith Oldwick could make himself, but he realized that it was only so by chance. At any instant the machine might plunge to earth, and even if by some miracle of chance the black could succeed in rising above the treetops and make a successful flight, there was not one chance in 100,000 that he could ever land again without killing his fair captive and himself. But what was that? His heart stood still.